Cold rain fell from the dark alien sky, covering the streets with a silver mist. Water dripped from high walls made of strange metal. The air filled with the smell of smoke and damp stone. In the middle of a narrow alley, a young alien girl sat. On the ground, her small knees pulled up to her chest, her thin arms wrapped tightly around her legs as she tried to make herself small and unseen. Her skin was pale with a soft blue hue, and her large eyes shone dimly under the weak light from a single flickering street lamp. She was shaking from the cold and from fear. Her clothes were gone, ripped away earlier by a cruel group that had laughed at her and shouted ugly words in their own language. They had thrown scraps of garbage at her, bits of rotting food and dirty rags. The smell clung to her, and the wet trash stuck to her skin. She could hear the sound of footsteps far away, but no one stopped. Some glanced in her direction only to quickly look away. A few muttered to each other, but none dared to help. In this part of the city, no one cared about the weak. The rain fell harder now, running down her face and mixing with the tears she tried to hide. She had no strength left to move. The alley felt like a prison, its high walls trapping her in a place where hope could not enter. Then she heard footsteps again, but these were different, heavy, steady, each step making a soft splash in the puddles on the street. The sound drew closer and closer until a shadow stretched over her from the alley's entrance. She slowly lifted her head, expecting another stranger who might spit at her or kick her aside. Instead, she saw a human, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long brown coat that looked heavy and warm. The coat was wet from the rain, but still gave off a feeling of strength and safety. His face was partly hidden by the shadow of his hood, but his eyes were sharp and full of focus. He stopped a few steps away from her and looked down without speaking. She tried to shrink even smaller, her thin frame trembling as she waited for the first cruel word or strike. But instead of moving away, he stepped closer. His boots splashed through the shallow water. The faint smell of leather and rain reached her as he knelt down. He spoke softly, his voice deep but calm. She could not understand the words, yet somehow they did not feel dangerous. The human's gaze softened as he reached for the buttons of his coat. Slowly he pulled it off and draped it around her shoulders. The sudden warmth made her gasp, and she clutched the fabric tightly. It was far too big for her, but it felt like the safest thing she had ever known. The coat smelled of rain and faint spice and something she could not name, but it made her chest ache with an emotion she had almost forgotten. The man worked to wrap it firmly around her, pulling the lapels closed so the wind could not cut through. People passing by slowed to watch, some frowning in disapproval, others whispering in low tones. A few laughed at the sight of a human giving his coat to an alien girl in the dirt. But the man ignored them all. His focus stayed on her as if the rest of the world did not matter. Her breath came out in short bursts, the cold slowly leaving her body. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Her throat felt dry and weak. The human gave a small nod as if to say it was all right. He rose to his feet and extended his hand toward her. For a moment she stared at it, unsure if she should trust him. Her life had been nothing but cruelty from strangers for as long as she could remember, yet there was something in his eyes, a quiet promise that he would not harm her. With slow movements, she placed her trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, firm but gentle. He helped her to stand, the coat's heavy folds hanging around her like a shield. The rain still fell, running down the sides of the alley and pooling near their feet. The man glanced toward the street and then back at her. He gave a small tilt of his head, a gesture telling her to follow. She took a small step, then another, each one feeling like it might be a mistake, yet unable to resist the pull of safety his presence gave. The crowd outside the alley watched them pass, some spitting on the ground, some shaking their heads. The human kept her close, one hand still holding hers, his body between her and the hostile stares. She tried to hide her face in the folds of the coat, but could still hear the whispers around her. As they reached the mouth of the alley, she looked up at him once more. The rain caught in his hair, darkening it. His jaw was set as if he had already decided on something important. She did not know where he was taking her, but for the first time in a long while she felt a faint spark inside. It was not quite hope, but it was close. And it was enough to make her follow him into the unknown streets beyond. The rain was still falling when they stepped out from the alley into the wider street. Puddles spread across the uneven ground, reflecting the dim glow of tall street lamps that flickered like tired eyes. The human kept the alien girl close to his side, his hand holding hers as if he feared she might vanish if he let go. She moved carefully, her bare feet splashing softly in the cold water. Every step made her legs ache, but she forced herself to keep walking. The heavy coat he had given her dragged at her small frame, yet it wrapped her in a comfort she did not want to lose. The people on the street slowed to look at them. Some frowned in suspicion, others whispered in harsh tones. A few shook their heads as if judging the human for caring about someone like her. She tried to make herself smaller, but his presence blocked much of their gaze. His eyes stayed forward, ignoring the noise around them. She could feel the steady rhythm of his stride through his hand. It was strong and sure, so different from the hurried and nervous movements of others she had met. He guided her on a corner and into a smaller side road. The noise of the main street faded, replaced by the soft sound of rain hitting metal roofs above them. The smell of wet stone and distant cooking drifted through the air. She glanced up at him, trying to read his face. His jaw was tight, and his eyes narrowed as though thinking deeply about something important. Yet when he looked down at her, his gaze softened, almost like he was trying to tell her without words that she was safe. They stopped beneath an old awning that sagged under the weight of rainwater. He crouched down so they were eye to eye. His voice was gentle, though she could not understand the words. Slowly he reached into one of the coat's deep pockets and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Unwrapping it revealed a piece of bread and something wrapped in thin paper. The smell of warm spices made her mouth water instantly. He held it out to her with a slight nod. Her hands trembled as she took the bread. Biting into it quickly, the taste filled her with a warmth that spread from her mouth down into her chest. It had been too long since she had eaten anything fresh. The human watched silently, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles. When she finished the bread, he gave her the paper-wrapped food. Inside was a small pastry, sweet and soft. She ate it slowly, savoring every bite. The rain drummed gently against the awning, creating a rhythm that made the moment feel separate from the cold and cruel city outside. She looked at him and tried to speak. Her voice was rough and broken. The words in her own language were useless to him, but she hoped he could feel what she meant. She wanted to thank him, but also to ask why. Why would a stranger, a human in an alien city, care enough to stop for her? He reached out and adjusted the coat around her shoulders, making sure it stayed tight. Then he pointed down the road. A faint light glowed there, softer and warmer than the street lamps. She hesitated, fear still holding her back. But his hand extended again, open and patient. After a moment, she placed her hand in his once more. The simple contact eased the knot in her chest. They walked together toward the light. The road narrowed further, its walls covered in faded signs and old posters that flapped in the damp air. The few figures they passed gave curious glances, but no one spoke. At the end of the road stood a small building with a door of dark wood. A single lantern hung above it, casting a welcoming glow. The human opened the door and a rush of warmth spilled out. Inside the building, the air smelled of soup and bread and faint smoke from a fire. Several humans sat at tables, talking quietly. All eyes turned toward them when they entered. The alien girl froze, uncertain of this new place, but the man gently guided her inside. He led her to a chair near the fire and motioned for her to sit. She obeyed, feeling the heat sink into her chilled skin. One of the humans, a woman with kind eyes and gray streaks in her hair, approached carrying a thick blanket. She draped it over the girl without a word. Then she set down a steaming cup on the table. The human who had brought her here spoke to the woman in his own language. His tone was low and serious. The woman glanced at the girl, then back at him, and gave a short nod. The girl held the cup in her hands, letting the heat seep into her fingers before taking a sip. The drink was strange but pleasant, sweet with a faint spice she did not know. Her body began to relax for the first time in what felt like forever. The human sat across from her, his eyes watching, perhaps to make sure she would not be frightened. She met his gaze for a moment before looking down. The coat still wrapped around her like a shield against the world outside, somewhere deep inside. A tiny spark began to grow. It was not just warmth from the coat or the food or the fire. It was something she had almost forgotten existed. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, she was not completely alone anymore. Morning light broke through the gray clouds, weak and pale, as if the sun itself did not wish to be in this place. The alien girl sat near the fire in the small human shelter, wrapped in the coat that had become her only shield. The warmth of the night had helped her rest, but she had not truly slept. Too many sounds from outside, too many shadows moving behind her closed eyes. The human who had found her stood near the door, speaking quietly to the woman with gray streaks in her hair. They glanced at her from time to time, their voices low. She could not understand their words, but she knew they were making plans. When he finally approached her, she felt a flicker of unease. He motioned for her to stand and pointed toward the door. She hesitated, gripping the coat tightly. The world outside was full of eyes that judged and hands that hurt, but there was no harshness in his expression. Only patience. She rose slowly, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. He opened the door, and the morning air rushed in, sharp and damp. The street beyond was already busy. Alien merchants called out in strange voices, selling fruits that glowed faintly and fabrics that shimmered in the light. Workers moved carts loaded with metal parts that clanged together. The human stepped out first, then looked back and gave her a small nod. She followed, staying close. The coat's heavy folds dragged along the ground, but she refused to let go of it. Almost immediately she felt the weight of stares pressing against her. Groups of aliens slowed their steps to watch, their eyes narrowing. Some whispered to each other, their words sharp and cold, even if she could not understand them. A child pointed at her and laughed until a taller alien pulled him away. The human's hand reached for hers again, strong and steady. She clung to it as though it were the only solid thing in a shifting sea. They turned down a wider road where the smell of cooked food mixed with the scent of oil and whetstone. Here, the voices were louder and the people bolder. A tall alien with scaled skin spat near her feet. Another threw a small piece of garbage that bounced off the coat. She flinched, but the human did not slow his pace. Instead, he shifted his body so he walked between her and the crowd, his shoulders squared and his gaze locked forward. They passed under a high archway where the shadows were deep. From somewhere above came the faint sound of dripping water. A pair of aliens leaned against the wall there, their eyes following every step she took. One muttered something with a cruel smile. The human's jaw tightened, his hand squeezed hers. Not painfully, but enough to tell her he was ready to act if they tried anything. The two watched them go, but did not move from their place. The further they walked, the narrower the streets became. The buildings leaned inward, blocking much of the light. She could feel the air grow cooler. The human led her through this maze with a surety that made her wonder how long he had known these paths. From time to time he would glance back to make sure she was still with him. Each time she met his eyes, she felt a strange pull, as though some invisible thread connected them now. They came to a small marketplace, hidden between the buildings. Tables of rough wood were piled with items she could not name. Tools made from polished stone, jars of glowing liquid, small machines that hummed softly. The crowd here was mixed, both human and alien. Some humans nodded at the man as he passed. A few gave her curious glances, but none with the same coldness she had seen earlier. It was strange to be in a place where not every face held hate. Still, safety felt fragile, like thin glass that could shatter with one wrong step. A group of alien youths spotted her from across the market, their eyes lit with cruel amusement. They began to follow, keeping their distance but never looking away. The human noticed, his pace shifting slightly. He steered her toward a quieter side path, away from the crowd. The side path was lined with tall crates and barrels. The sound of the market faded quickly. Only the echo of their footsteps and the distant patter of rain filled the space. She glanced back and saw the group still following. Her heartbeat quickened. The human squeezed her hand again, then released it long enough to pull the coat tighter around her shoulders. His other hand went to the pocket of his trousers. She saw the faint shape of something long and solid beneath the fabric. They turned another corner, and the street opened. Up again. This time it led toward a large gate made of dark metal. Beyond the gate, she could see the faint outline of another part of the city. Taller buildings and wider streets. The human quickened his pace, urging her to match it. The following group slowed when they saw where he was heading. Perhaps they feared whoever guarded that side of the city. At the gate, 2 human guards stood with weapons resting against their shoulders. They straightened when they saw the man approaching. He spoke to them in quick, clipped words. One nodded and stepped aside, allowing them through. As they passed the threshold, the air seemed to shift. The sounds of the hostile streets behind them grew faint. The ground here was cleaner, the walls brighter. The girl looked back one last time. The group of youths still stood in the distance, watching with narrow eyes. Then the gate closed, and their figures vanished behind the metal. She let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. The human glanced down at her, not smiling, but softer now. She kept her eyes forward, gripping the coat as if it were part of her. For the first time that day, she believed they might truly reach somewhere safe. The metal gate shut behind them with a deep, heavy sound that seemed to close off more than just the street. The alien girl stood still for a moment, listening to the fading noise of the city's rough voices on the other side. Here the air felt calmer, carrying the smell of fresh bread mixed with the faint scent of wood smoke. The ground under her bare feet was smoother and warmer, as though this part of the city belonged to a different world. The human man gave her a small nod and began walking again. His stride was steady, guiding her down a long, narrow lane lined with low stone buildings. Their windows glowed with soft yellow light, and potted plants hung from wooden beams above. The doors, she had never been in a place like this. The people here did not shout or stare in open hostility. A few glanced at her, but their eyes were not filled with cruelty. They passed a small fountain in the middle of a square, where water trickled gently into a round stone basin. 2 human children played nearby, chasing each other and laughing. The sound was strange to her ears, pure and free of malice. She slowed her steps to watch them, but the man kept moving forward. His hand reached back for hers, and she followed again. At the far end of the square stood a building larger than the others. Its roof was steep and covered with red tiles. A sign above the wide wooden door was carved with words she could not read. The man stepped up to the door and pushed it open. A wave of warmth and the rich scent of soup and bread rolled out. Inside, the light was soft and golden. The floor was made of polished wood, and the walls were lined with shelves holding books and small carved figures. Several humans sat at long tables, talking quietly over bowls of food. They looked up when the man entered with her. Some eyebrows lifted. A few whispers passed between them, but none spoke aloud. The man guided her toward the far side of the room where a fireplace burned gently. She lowered herself into a chair near the fire, feeling the warmth reach her cold fingers and toes. The man spoke to someone behind a counter, a tall human with a scar along one cheek. The tall man listened, his expression shifting between concern and curiosity. Then he called toward the back, and a woman emerged carrying a folded blanket. She came over and draped it over the girl's shoulders without hesitation. The softness made her shiver, not from cold, but from something she could not name. The man returned and placed a wooden bowl in front of her. Inside was thick soup with chunks of vegetables and pieces of meat. The smell alone made her stomach twist with hunger. She lifted the spoon carefully and tasted it. The warmth spread down her. throat and into her chest. She ate slowly at first, then faster. The man sat across from her, his hands folded on the table. He did not rush her or speak. Just watched to make sure she had what she needed. When the bowl was empty, the woman returned with a small piece of soft bread and a cup of warm drink. The girl took them gratefully, sipping and chewing while her eyes wandered around the room. There were other humans here of different ages and faces. Some had skin dark like the deep night sky, others pale like snow. A few wore clothes patched in many places. Others had clean and fine garments. All of them seemed to belong here, and none looked at her with open hate. The man spoke quietly to the tall human again. They exchanged short nods, and the tall man left the room. Soon the woman returned with a small basin of water and a clean cloth. She placed them near the fire and gestured gently. The girl understood and moved closer. She dipped the cloth into the warm water and wiped away the dirt and grime from her arms and face. The water turned dark quickly, but the woman replaced it without complaint. The fire crackled softly as she worked. Each time she glanced toward the man, he was still watching her. His face remained calm, but his eyes seemed to carry a silent promise. It made her wonder if he had done this before, helping strangers in need, or if she was the first. The thought both warmed and unsettled her. When she finished, the woman handed her a simple dress, plain but clean. She hesitated before looking at the man. He nodded once, giving her quiet permission. She slipped into a small side room and changed. The fabric felt strange but pleasant. Against her skin, she folded the coat carefully and hugged it to her chest before stepping back into the main room. The man's gaze softened when he saw her. He gestured toward the chair again, and she sat, the blanket still over her shoulders, the coat resting in her lap. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and calm. She did not know his words, but she felt the intent behind them, a mixture of reassurance and warning. She nodded, though unsure exactly what she agreed to. The warmth of the fire, the weight of the coat, and the quiet murmur of voices around her began to pull at her tired mind. Her eyelids grew heavy, but she fought to keep them open. Some part of her feared that if she slept, the safety around her might vanish. The man noticed and stood. He spoke briefly to the woman, who smiled gently and led the girl to a small bed in a corner behind a curtain. She sat down on the bed, clutching the coat as the woman pulled the blanket over her. The firelight from the main room cast soft shadows on the wall. The man remained near the doorway, his tall frame like a silent guardian. Only when her breathing slowed did he turn back toward the fire. The curtain swayed slightly as if sealing her inside a space of rare peace. The alien girl woke to the sound of quiet voices beyond the curtain. For a moment she did not remember where she was. Her hands clutched the coat in her lap, the fabric warm from her own body heat. Slowly the events of the night returned to her mind. The alley, the rain, the human's hand reaching out, and the safety of this place. She sat up and listened. The voices were calm but carried a certain weight. One of them was the human man, his tone steady. The other was the woman with gray streaks in her hair. Their words were impossible for her to understand, but she felt they were speaking about her. She pushed the blanket aside and stood. Her bare feet touched the smooth wooden floor. She stepped out from behind the curtain into the warm glow of the main room. The fire still burned softly, filling the air with gentle heat. The man looked at her and gave a small nod. His eyes searched her face as if to check if she was truly all right. She offered a faint smile, but it felt weak. She wanted to thank him, but her words would mean nothing to his ears. The woman came over with a bowl of porridge and a cup of water. The girl sat at the table and began to eat slowly. The man joined her, sitting across from her with his hands folded. After a few bites, she stopped and tried to speak. The sounds of her own language fell into the air like broken pieces. He listened carefully, but his brow furrowed. He could not understand. Frustration burned in her chest. She tried again, using her hands to show pieces of her story. She pointed to herself, then made a tearing motion at her clothing. She mimed shivering in the cold. Then she gestured as if throwing something. The same way the aliens had thrown garbage at her. Her eyes dropped to the floor as she wrapped her arms around herself. The man's jaw tightened. His hands curled slightly on the table. He understood enough. She had been attacked. Stripped of her dignity and left to freeze, his gaze softened again as he looked at her. The woman had stopped moving and now stood nearby, her expression a mixture of sadness and quiet anger. The girl took a shaky breath and tried to show more. She raised her hands to her head, making the shape of a hood, then pointed toward the street. She drew the outline of several figures in the air, her fingers sharp and quick, her face twisted in fear as she acted out their mocking laughter. Finally she mimed collapsing, her arms folding inward. Her eyes shimmered but no tears fell. She had learned not to cry where others could see. The man leaned forward, speaking softly. His voice was low and careful. She wished she could understand. His tone was not pitying but protective. The woman placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. Gentle but firm. The warmth of the touch startled her. It had been so long since kindness had come without hidden cruelty. The fire cracked softly as the man stood. He went to a shelf and took down a folded cloth. Inside it was bread and a small piece of dried meat. He set it on the table in front of her, gesturing for her to take it. She hesitated before nodding and tucking it into the coat's deep pocket. She understood it was meant for later, a small act of care for the road ahead. Outside, the sound of light rain began again. She turned toward the window. The world beyond these walls looked the same as the one that had left her in the alley, gray and cold. Yet something inside her felt different. She glanced back at the man. He was speaking to the woman again, his hands moving as if explaining something important. The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she nodded. The girl wanted to tell them more, but her mind felt like a door locked from the inside. The memories of that day in the alley were sharp and heavy. Each time she reached for them, her chest tightened. She wanted to explain that she had no home to return to, that the people who had hurt her might still be looking for her. She wanted to explain the hunger that had followed her for days, the aching loneliness, the cold that had reached her bones. Instead, she lowered her head. The coat's collar brushed her cheek, reminding her of the moment he had placed it around her shoulders. That single act had cut through the darkness more than words ever could. She knew he did not owe her anything. Yet he had chosen to stop, to help, to stay. The woman brought over a small piece of cloth and a pot of warm water. She gestured for the girl to hold out her hands. Gently she cleaned away the dirt that still clung to her skin. Her touch was light but steady. The girl watched the water darken as the grime was washed away. It felt strange to see her own skin again, pale with its soft blue hue, no longer hidden under the city's filth. When the cleaning was done, the man handed her a scarf. Its fabric was thin but strong, dyed a warm, earthy color. He pointed to his own neck, showing her how to wrap it. She followed, the scarf fitting snugly under the coat's collar. It was another layer between her and the cold, another shield against the world outside. The fire's warmth filled the space between them. The girl sat quietly, feeling the weight of unspoken things pressing in. She could not tell her story fully, but she knew that he understood enough to know it had been cruel and unjust. That seemed to be enough for now, for the first time since she had been found in the alley. She let her shoulders relax. Her eyes closed briefly as she listened to the soft sound of rain on the roof. Somewhere beyond the locked doors and quiet walls, the city still moved with its noise and danger. But here, in this small place, she felt the faintest echo of safety, and it was enough to keep her from falling back into the darkness entirely. The morning came with a gray light that slipped through the cracks of the curtains. The alien girl sat on the edge of the small bed behind the divider. The coat was wrapped tightly around her. She had not slept much. The sound of the rain had faded in the early hours, but her mind had been loud with worry. She kept thinking about the figures she had seen in the alley, the ones who had laughed as they threw garbage at her. She did not know if they had seen where she had gone, but she feared they might come looking. The man moved about the room quietly, gathering a few things into a small pack. His face was calm, but his movements were quick. The woman placed bread and a flask of water on the table. She spoke softly to him, her tone serious. The girl watched from her place, trying to read their faces. The man glanced at her more than once, each time with a look that seemed both protective and urgent. When they sat to eat, the man pointed to the scarf around her neck and then to the door. He made a walking motion with his fingers. She understood. They would be leaving. She nodded, though her stomach tightened at the thought of going outside again. They stepped out into the damp morning. The air was cool, and the street smelled of wet stone and faint smoke. The girl stayed close to him, her head lowered. The woman waved from the doorway until they turned a corner. The man led her through narrow side streets, avoiding the busier paths. His steps were sure, as if he knew every hidden turn. Still, the girl felt the eyes of the city on her. She caught movement at the edge of her vision, a shadow slipping behind a wall. Her heart began to race. They passed a small market where vendors set out baskets of fruit and bread. The man bought nothing, keeping his pace steady. The girl tried to focus on the sound of his boots on the stone, but the feeling of being followed grew stronger. She glanced back and saw a figure standing at the far end of the street, too far to see clearly, but the shape felt familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. The man noticed her looking back and slowed. He turned his head slightly, and his eyes narrowed. Without a word, he took her hand and guided her down another alley. The walls here were close and damp. The smell of the market faded, replaced by the scent of rusted metal and old rainwater. They moved faster now. His grip on her hand was firm, but not painful. The girl kept up, her bare feet silent on the wet ground. A sudden sound echoed behind them, the clatter of something metal falling. The man did not stop to look. He pulled her forward until they reached a wider street. Here the city seemed louder, voices mixing with the sound of carts and footsteps. The man led her into the crowd, weaving between people. The girl tried to keep her head down, but curiosity pulled her eyes upward for a moment. That was when she saw them, two figures from the alley, moving through the crowd with sharp eyes, searching. Their clothes were rough and dark, their expressions cold. The man must have seen them too, because his pace quickened again. He turned suddenly into another narrow path, pulling her along. The sound of footsteps followed. Closer now, the girl's breath came faster, her mind flashing back to that night when she had been cornered. They reached a small gate at the end of the alley. The man pushed it open and pulled her through, slamming it shut behind them. They entered a yard behind a quiet workshop. The air smelled faintly of oil and wood. The man pressed a finger to his lips, urging her to stay silent. They waited there, hidden by stacked crates. The girl could hear the faint sound of footsteps passing on the other side of the gate. Her heart pounded in her ears. She gripped the edge of the coat tightly, afraid that if she let go, she might disappear back into that cold world. After a few minutes, the sound faded. The man exhaled slowly. He looked at her and gave a small nod as if to say they were safe for now. Then he motioned for her to follow again. This time they moved more carefully, staying in the shadows where the streets were empty. They reached a small bridge that crossed a narrow stream. The water below was dark and slow. On the other side stood a building made of dark stone. The man pushed open the heavy door and led her inside. The air was warmer here, lit by a few lanterns. Several people looked up as they entered, their faces curious but not unkind. The man spoke to one of them, a tall figure with a deep voice. The girl could not understand the words, but she saw the other nod and gesture toward a set of stairs. They were being given a place to stay. Upstairs there was a small room with a single bed and a window that looked out over the stream. The man closed the door and set his pack down. He checked the lock on the window before sitting in the chair by the wall. The girl sat on the bed, her hands still gripping the coat. She knew they had escaped for now, but the danger had not ended. Somewhere out there, the ones who had hurt her were still searching. The memory of their faces, their laughter, and the cold sting of that night clung to her like a shadow. But here in this quiet room, with the man close by. She felt a small spark of safety. It was not enough to erase the fear, but it was enough to make her believe they could keep moving forward. The night was cold and quiet. The small room above the stream felt still but not safe. The girl sat on the bed watching the man as he sat by the window. His eyes were on the dark street below. A lantern glowed softly in the corner, casting shadows across the walls. The girl kept the coat wrapped tight around her small frame. Her heart still carried the weight of the day. The memory of those figures in the crowd would not leave her mind. The man did not speak much, but his body was tense. His hand rested near a short metal rod leaning against the wall. It was clear he was waiting, listening for something. Outside, the wind pushed against the building, making the wooden beams creak. The girl shifted nervously, the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears. When the knock came, it was soft, almost polite. The man's head turned sharply toward the door. He stood slowly and placed a finger to his lips, telling her not to move. He stepped toward the door and stood there for a moment, listening. Then the knock came again, this time louder, from downstairs. Came the sound of footsteps, voices, and the scrape of chairs. Someone was speaking in a low, urgent tone. The man opened the door slightly, and a tall figure from earlier slipped inside. His face was pale, and his voice quick as he spoke to the man. The girl could not understand the words, but she knew from their tone that danger was close. The tall figure left as quickly as he came. The man shut the door and went to his pack, pulling out a small bundle. From it he took a piece of bread and pressed it into the girl's hand. His eyes told her to eat now, because there might not be time later. She took a small bite, but her stomach was too tight for more. Then came the crash, glass breaking somewhere below, followed by shouting. The man moved to the window and looked down. His jaw tightened. He turned to her and motioned for her to stay low. He picked up the metal rod and stepped toward the door. But before he could open it, the sound of boots pounded up the stairs. The door burst open and a shadow filled the frame. One of the figures from the alley stood there, his eyes cold and his mouth curled into a cruel smile. Behind him another stepped into view. The girl froze, the bread slipping from her hand. The man stepped forward, placing himself between her and the intruders. His voice was calm but firm. The words were short and sharp. The first figure laughed, taking a step closer. His hand reached for the man's shoulder, but in a flash the metal rod came up and knocked his arm aside. The man moved quickly, striking again to drive the figure back toward the hall. The second intruder lunged, but the man sidestepped and pushed him hard against the wall. The girl watched with wide eyes as the struggle filled the narrow space. The sound of boots and shouts came from below as others from the building rushed up to help. The fight was fast and rough. The man's movements were sure, his strikes precise. The first intruder swung wildly, but the man ducked and hit him hard across the ribs. The second tried to grab the rod, but the man twisted it free and shoved him toward the stairs where two more people grabbed him. The tall figure from earlier appeared again, this time holding a heavy piece of wood. Together they drove the intruders back down the stairs. The sound of the fight moved toward the street. The girl stood in the doorway clutching the coat, her hands trembling. From the window she saw the intruders pushed out into the night. One stumbled into the stream, cursing, while the other staggered away clutching his side. The man stood in the doorway below, his chest rising and falling with each breath. His eyes searched the shadows as if to make sure none remained. When he came back upstairs, his hands were scraped and there was a small cut on his cheek, but his eyes were calm. He closed the door and set the metal rod back against the wall. The girl wanted to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She simply stepped forward and placed her small hands on the coat, as if to show him she still had it, still treasured it. He gave a small nod and sat back in the chair by the window. The night outside was still dangerous, but for now the building was quiet. The girl knew the danger might return, but she also knew that he would stand between her and whatever came. He had chosen to protect her when no one else had. and she felt the warmth of that choice even in the cold night air. Downstairs, the voices of the others carried softly. Some spoke with anger, some with relief. The girl did not understand their words, but she felt their mood. They had stood together. They had not abandoned the weak. As the lantern light flickered across the walls, she closed her eyes. Not in fear, but in something close to peace. She still heard the sound of the stream below, steady and calm, and the quiet creak of the chair as the man kept watch. She knew he would not let her face the darkness alone. And for the first time since that terrible night in the alley, she allowed herself to rest.